He gave them everything: sprawling mansions with gates higher than any neighbors, cars that gleamed in the sunlight like trophies of success, and a company worth billions that carried his name on every boardroom wall. To the outside world, Richard Cole had it all: the wealth, the respect, the legacy of a self-made man. But the moment he fell ill, the empire he built from the ground up began to crack. His wife, the woman who once held his hand in times of struggle, turned cold and distant. His children, heirs to his fortune, did not gather around him in love. They circled like vultures, fighting one another, clawing for a future that wasn't even theirs yet. And here's the twist Richard never revealed to them. He wasn't sick at all. He was watching. He was testing. And what he uncovered about his own bloodline would shock the world forever. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. Why would a billionaire fake his own sickness? For a man like Richard Cole, whose empire stretched from Miami's oceanfront towers to boardrooms across the nation, the question wasn't about wealth, it was about truth. In the quiet halls of his mansion, as his family whispered and plotted, Richard wanted to know one thing: who among them truly loved him, and who was there only because of the money. Behind the smiles and carefully rehearsed words of concern, he sensed a hunger he could not ignore. But it wasn't until he withdrew, pretending to be frail and near death, that the masks began to slip. His wife's warmth faded into calculation. His children, once bound by his authority, turned on each other like strangers fighting over scraps. And as Richard watched from the shadows of his own home, he realized he had set into motion a test that would reveal their truest selves in ways he could never have imagined. Richard Cole's story was not one of privilege. He wasn't born into money, nor did he inherit a fortune from some distant relative. He built his empire brick by brick, deal by deal, in the competitive world of Miami real estate. Hotels that lit up the skyline, luxury apartments that catered to the wealthy elite, and private jets that carried his name into boardrooms from New York to Los Angeles, these were the monuments of his determination. He became a self-made billionaire, a symbol of what grit and relentless ambition could accomplish in America. Yet for all his success, Richard carried with him a fear he could not conquer: the fear of growing old and being left behind. Money had never abandoned him, but people could. And for a man who had given everything to his family, the thought that they might not stand by him in his weakest hour haunted him more than any business risk he had ever taken. At the center of Richard's life was Evelyn, his wife of 30 years. Elegant, graceful, always poised for society's gaze, Evelyn had long been admired in Miami's social circles. But those who looked closer noticed the distance in her eyes, the chill in her smile. To the outside world, she was the perfect partner to a billionaire, but inside the walls of their mansion, her affection toward Richard had grown faint over the years. Perhaps it was the long hours he dedicated to his empire. Perhaps it was the way wealth had shifted the balance of their marriage. Richard, however, knew one thing for certain: Evelyn loved the lifestyle more than the man who provided it. And as he quietly prepared his deception, pretending to be sick, he wondered if her loyalty was ever truly his, or if it was always tied to the empire he built. Then there was Michael, the eldest son, groomed to inherit the crown. Ambitious, calculating, and power-hungry, Michael believed it was his destiny to take over his father's company. He shadowed Richard in boardrooms, watched every decision, and waited for the day he could claim the title of CEO. But beneath that ambition was impatience. Michael didn't want to wait for Richard to step aside gracefully. He wanted control now. His father's illness, real or not, was an opportunity one Michael had been preparing for all his life. Richard suspected this about him, and it was one of the reasons he staged his sickness. He needed to know if his eldest son cared about the man, or just the throne. Daniel, the second son, was cut from an entirely different cloth. Reckless, careless with money, Daniel saw his father's empire as an endless fountain of wealth that would never run dry. Expensive cars, high-stakes gambling, parties that lasted until dawn, Daniel indulged in all of it. Richard loved him as a son but feared for him as a man. Unlike Michael, Daniel showed little interest in the business, but when the whispers of Richard's illness spread, Daniel's recklessness turned into something more dangerous: desperation. He feared the money might slip away, and with it the life he had built around excess. Richard watched closely, wondering if Daniel's concern for his health was genuine, or if it was simply a fear of losing his lifeline. Sophia, the eldest daughter, carried herself like royalty. Beautiful, stylish, admired by her peers, she was the embodiment of a material world. But with her beauty came vanity, and with her privilege came entitlement. She had grown accustomed to having her desires met without question. Richard adored her, yet he often worried she valued appearances more than substance. As he tested his family, Richard watched how Sophia's reaction to his illness unfolded. Would she stand by his side out of love for her father? Or would she treat his weakness as an inconvenience that threatened her carefully crafted world of status and glamour? Emily, the youngest of Richard's children, was the outlier. Unlike her siblings, she had no hunger for power, no obsession with wealth. Compassionate, loyal, and gentle in nature, Emily often stood as Richard's reminder that love could still exist in a family clouded by money. She cared deeply, not for the empire, but for the man himself. Richard knew that if anyone's affection was real, it was Emily's. But even she was not beyond his test. He needed to see if her loyalty could withstand the pressure of a family tearing itself apart. In his heart, he hoped Emily's love would be the one constant that would not shatter under the weight of greed. Together, they were Richard Cole's world: Evelyn, Michael, Daniel, Sophia, and Emily. To outsiders, they looked like the perfect family of privilege, the kind others envied from afar. But Richard knew appearances could deceive. Behind the luxury dinners, the charity galas, and the photographs of smiling faces, he sensed fractures deep within his home. His greatest fear was that once he was gone, the empire he built would not only collapse, but his family would devour itself in the process. And so, with the weight of his fortune pressing down on every relationship, Richard made the decision that would define the rest of his life: to test them all, even if it meant playing the part of a dying man. Late one evening, when the mansion was quiet and the city lights glowed across the Miami skyline, Richard Cole met in secret with two men he trusted more than anyone else. Henry Davis, his longtime lawyer, had guided him through countless business negotiations. Dr. Parker, a physician who had been by Richard's side for decades, knew both his medical history and his deepest fears. It was here, in a private study behind closed doors, that Richard laid out the plan that would alter the course of his family forever. He told them he needed the truth, not just polite gestures or staged affection, but raw, unfiltered reality. Henry's role would be to secure the assets, to quietly move half of Richard's wealth into protected accounts his family couldn't touch. Dr. Parker's role was more dangerous: to become the voice of authority in declaring an illness that did not exist. The scheme was carefully constructed. Richard would act the part of a dying man, weak and fading, his body failing him day by day. Henry Davis drafted the legal protections in silence, ensuring Richard's empire would not collapse if greed took hold. Dr. Parker rehearsed his words, choosing a diagnosis that carried weight, one that would silence questions and demand sympathy. Together, they settled on a story that was both believable and terrifying. Cancer. 6 months to live. It was a sentence that carried with it a gravity no one in the family could ignore. Richard's chest tightened as he realized what he was about to do, but he knew it was the only way to see their true colors. The next morning, Richard's performance began. At breakfast, instead of sitting tall at the head of the table, he appeared weak, his hands trembling as he reached for his glass. He coughed deliberately, pushing away the food Evelyn had carefully arranged before him. When Emily asked if he was all right, Richard shook his head, muttering about exhaustion. By the second day, his family had begun to notice the change. The man who had once commanded boardrooms with unshakable confidence now struggled to walk across a room. By the third day, whispers filled the mansion, a quiet storm of worry and speculation. Richard let it all unfold, keeping his act steady, his eyes betraying nothing of the truth. Then came the announcement. Gathered in the grand living room, the family watched as Dr. Parker delivered the verdict. His tone was somber, heavy with authority. "It's cancer," he said, his voice echoing against the marble walls. 6 months to live at best. Gasps filled the air. Evelyn covered her mouth in shock, her eyes welling with tears. Michael stiffened, his jaw tightening as if bracing for the storm ahead. Daniel's face paled, the reality of the words hitting him like a wave. Sophia let out a cry, clinging to her mother, and Emily's sweet, loyal Emily broke into sobs, rushing to her father's side. Richard sat silently, frail and resigned, watching the performance unfold exactly as planned. In those first days, the mask of love seemed intact. Evelyn fussed over him, ensuring he ate, though he always pushed the food aside. Michael offered to take over more company responsibilities, masking his eagerness with a show of concern. Daniel swore to cut back on his reckless habits, claiming he would honor his father's legacy. Sophia visited his room daily, her tears as dramatic as her personality, holding his hand and declaring her devotion. And Emily, more than anyone else, stayed by his side, refusing to let him face a single moment alone. For a week, the mansion was filled with the illusion of unity, but illusions never last. By the second week, subtle cracks began to appear. Evelyn's late-night phone calls grew longer, her voice cold and calculating when she thought no one was listening. Michael pressed Henry Davis with questions about the company's succession plan, questions that revealed more hunger for control than worry for his father's health. Daniel slipped back into his habits, disappearing for nights on end, and returning with excuses Richard knew too well. Sophia, once endlessly devoted, began to skip her visits, distracted by parties and appearances. Only Emily remained unchanged, steadfast and sincere. Richard watched it all in silence, his heart heavy with confirmation. His test was working, the masks were slipping, and the truth of his family was beginning to show. At first, grief had filled the air of the Cole mansion. But as days turned into weeks, grief began to fade, replaced by something else. A quiet selfishness. A greed that Richard had long suspected, but never before seen so clearly. Evelyn, his wife of 3 decades, began making excuses. At first, she said she was too exhausted to sit by his bedside every night. Then, her visits grew less frequent. By the 3rd week, she had stopped coming entirely. When Emily begged her mother to stay, Evelyn's response was cold, almost rehearsed. "I can't watch him suffer." She buried herself in social events, seen at galas and luncheons across Miami, her diamond necklaces glistening while her husband withered alone in the mansion's east wing. Richard watched from a distance, his suspicions confirmed. Evelyn's love had always been for the lifestyle, not the man. Michael, the eldest son, grew bolder by the day. At first his visits were filled with forced concern, but soon his ambitions surfaced. One afternoon, he sat across from his father, eyes sharp and calculating. "Dad," he said, his voice steady, "the company can't wait for uncertainty. You need to sign over control now before it's too late." Richard, feigning weakness, nodded silently, buying himself time. But behind the frail act, his mind was racing. Through Henry Davis, he began documenting Michael's moves. Soon, reports confirmed what Richard feared. Michael had started hosting lavish parties at the penthouse office, burning company funds as though the empire were already his. Bottles of champagne flowed, luxury cars were rented on the company's dime, and executives whispered their unease. The heir apparent wasn't stepping into responsibility, he was squandering it. Sophia, his eldest daughter, had her own ways of coping, or rather, exploiting. Within weeks of her father's supposed diagnosis, she began draining the family accounts. Jewelry stores, high-end fashion houses, exclusive art galleries, her name appeared everywhere. Her social media feeds showed her smiling with new designer bags, her captions dripping with vanity. "Life is short," she posted under one photo, a glass of champagne in her hand. Richard read those words with a heavy heart. For Sophia, his illness wasn't tragedy. It was opportunity, a justification for indulgence, a mask for greed. Daniel, the second son, was even more reckless. Night after night, he disappeared into Miami's neon-soaked underworld. Expensive nightclubs, high-stakes gambling tables, women on his arm who cared only for his name and wealth. Richard's investigators reported losses in the hundreds of thousands, money funneled from family accounts into the hands of dealers and casinos. The same son who had once promised to do better in those early days of Richard's illness had proven himself a liability, confirming every fear Richard had ever harbored. And yet, amid the collapse of loyalty, there was one light that never dimmed. Emily, his youngest daughter. She stayed by his side through every night, every cough, every staged moment of weakness. When the others vanished to parties, clubs, or shopping sprees, Emily remained. She brought him food on trays she prepared herself, though he barely touched it. She cleaned his room when Evelyn refused to hire extra help. She held his hand when the pain, though false, seemed unbearable. And when she thought no one else was listening, she whispered words that cut straight through the deception. "Daddy, I'll never leave you." For Richard, those words were both a comfort and a dagger. A comfort because they revealed the truth he longed to find, that at least one member of his family loved him for who he was, not for his wealth. But a dagger because it confirmed just how hollow the other's affections had always been. As weeks passed, Richard quietly intensified the investigation. Henry Davis arranged for discreet audits, tracing every dollar his children touched. Private security teams monitored their movements, gathering evidence that would later serve as proof of their true intentions. Dr. Parker played his role perfectly, updating the family with carefully staged declines in Richard's condition. And Richard himself, though hidden beneath the mask of a dying man, absorbed every detail, his mind recording the betrayal unfolding around him. The mansion had become a theater of truth, and Richard Cole was both the actor and the audience. By the 35th minute of Richard Cole's so-called decline, the cracks in his family's facade had widened into gaping fractures. What had begun as subtle greed now evolved into open betrayal, shameless, calculated, and devastating. Late one evening, as the storm winds brushed against the windows of his Miami mansion, Richard sat quietly in the dim light of his study, feigning sleep in his leather chair. But his ears were sharp. From the hallway, he caught the hushed voices of Evelyn and Sophia. They didn't notice the door slightly ajar, nor the faint shadow of their husband and father listening just beyond the crack. Their conversation was chilling. Evelyn, elegant as ever, whispered in a tone cold as steel, "The Palm Beach estate must be sold before he dies. If we wait until after, Emily will fight us for it, and I refuse to let a child dictate what happens to Richard's legacy." Sophia agreed instantly, her voice dripping with selfish excitement. "I already have buyers lined up. The estate is worth millions, and the faster we sell, the faster we can move on." Richard's chest tightened, not from sickness, but from the betrayal he had orchestrated this entire charade to uncover. His favorite estate, the home he had built with his own two hands before the billions came, the one place that still carried the scent of his youth, his dreams, his beginnings. To Evelyn and Sophia, it was nothing more than a bargaining chip. To him, it was his heart. Meanwhile, Michael, once groomed as the heir, had abandoned all pretense of patience. He began firing loyal staff, men and women who had served Richard faithfully for decades. Drivers, secretaries, even the butler who had known Richard since his first million. Each dismissal carried the same excuse: "You're no longer needed." But everyone in the mansion knew the truth. Michael wasn't just cleaning house. He was silencing anyone who dared question his sudden rise in authority. Richard watched helplessly from his bed as beloved staff packed their belongings, tears in their eyes. The empire he had built on loyalty was being gutted from within by the very son he had trusted most. Daniel, the second son, had always been reckless. But now, he crossed a line even Richard hadn't expected. In secret, Daniel arranged to sell one of Richard's prized hotels, a cornerstone of his real estate empire, a hotel that had stood for decades as a monument to the Cole family name. Behind closed doors, Daniel scribbled his signature on fraudulent documents, desperate to convert heritage into quick cash. But fate and Richard's foresight had other plans. Lawyer Henry Davis, the man Richard trusted above all others, intercepted the deal just hours before it closed. With a calm but iron grip, Henry seized the documents and secured them in his office vault. When Daniel confronted him, rage burning in his eyes, Henry's only response was chilling in its finality. "You will not dismantle what your father built, not while I'm here." In the midst of this chaos, one voice still clung to reason. Emily, Richard's youngest daughter, his last hope. She stood in the grand dining hall as her siblings bickered over assets, her small frame dwarfed by their towering greed. With tears in her eyes, she cried out, "Stop fighting! Dad is still alive. He needs us. Can't you see what you're doing to him?" But her words, pure, desperate, filled with love, fell on deaf ears. Evelyn turned away. Michael smirked, as if her pleas were childish interruptions. Daniel stormed out, slamming the heavy oak doors behind him. And Sophia, ever dismissive, muttered under her breath, "She's too naive to understand." For Richard, lying upstairs in his bed, the truth had finally crystallized. His experiment was working. His sickness, though fabricated, had stripped away the illusions. It revealed Evelyn's cold ambition, Michael's hunger for power, Sophia's vanity, Daniel's recklessness, and Emily's unwavering loyalty. The family he had built his empire for was tearing it apart, and now, Richard knew there was no turning back. The moment of reckoning arrived on a stormy evening. The Cole mansion, once a beacon of wealth and unity, now carried the weight of greed, betrayal, and whispered secrets. And at the center of it all, Richard Cole sat in the grand study, his body slumped in a leather chair, his breath shallow, his face pale. He had summoned them all, Evelyn, Michael, Sophia, Daniel, and Emily. Alongside them stood Henry Davis, the loyal lawyer who had safeguarded every hidden detail of this deception. Even Dr. Parker, the man who had played his part in declaring Richard's so-called illness, was there, silent, uneasy, his eyes shifting nervously. The family filed in, their faces masks of impatience and unease. Michael's jaw was clenched, Daniel shifted restlessly, Sophia rolled her eyes, and Evelyn, draped in pearls, stood tall, her expression cold as stone. Only Emily looked genuinely broken, her hands trembling, eyes red from nights of crying by her father's bedside. For several long minutes, silence reigned. Only the ticking of the grandfather clock echoed through the study. Richard coughed weakly, his body shaking as though it might collapse. Then, with deliberate struggle, he whispered, "This may be my last night." Evelyn sighed dramatically, masking her indifference. Michael muttered under his breath, "Then let's get this over with." But before anyone could move, Richard straightened. Slowly at first, then with sudden force, he rose from the chair, his back straightened, his breathing steady, his voice no longer frail but thunderous, commanding the room as he once had boardrooms and empires. "Enough." The room froze. Evelyn's pearls rattled against her chest. Sophia's lips parted in shock. Michael stepped back, eyes wide, Daniel's face drained of color. And Emily, sweet, loyal. Emily gasped, tears spilling as hope flooded her heart. Richard's eyes blazed with fury as he declared, "I was never sick. Not a day. The illness, a lie. The doctors, an act. The weakness you saw, a test. And each of you revealed exactly who you are." The air thickened with disbelief. Evelyn's face turned pale, her lips trembling. "Richard? What are you saying?" He didn't hesitate. "I only wanted to see who truly loved me. Not my wealth, not my empire. Me." The silence shattered into chaos. Michael shouted in denial, his voice cracking. "You tricked us. You can't do this, Father. You can't." Sophia stammered, desperate. "It wasn't like that. I was just protecting what was ours." Daniel, cornered and exposed, sneered bitterly. "So this was your little game? To humiliate us?" But Richard raised a hand, and the room fell silent again. His words cut like a blade. "You call it humiliation. I call it truth." Then, with Henry Davis at his side, Richard pulled out a folder document signed and sealed. His decision, final and irreversible. The empire, every company, every estate, every asset will be placed in the hands of Emily, my youngest daughter, the only one who remained loyal, the only one who cared not for the wealth but for the man behind it. Emily's eyes widened, tears streaming freely. She shook her head, overwhelmed. "Daddy, I don't deserve this. I only wanted you." Richard stepped forward, pulling her into his arms. His voice softened for the first time in months. "And that, my dear, is why you do deserve it." But the storm for the others was just beginning. "Michael," Richard thundered, turning to his eldest, "you are cut off. No inheritance, no company, not a single cent." Michael's face twisted with rage, his voice rising in fury. "You'll regret this. You can't run an empire without me." Richard ignored him, eyes turning to Daniel. "Daniel, you chose gambling, lies, and betrayal. You sold what you did not own. You too are cut off. You will live with the consequences of your greed." Daniel cursed under his breath, his fists clenched, but he had no defense. Then Richard's gaze fell on Sophia. She flinched, her voice small, trembling. "Father, please, I only wanted security." Richard's voice was cold as stone. "Security built on deceit is nothing but sand. You are cut off." Finally, his eyes locked with Evelyn's. The woman he had once loved, the woman who had stood by his side in public, but had plotted against him in private. "Evelyn, my wife, you betrayed not just me but the vows we made. You will remain here only with a personal allowance, enough to live, nothing more." Evelyn's face broke for the first time, fury giving way to disbelief. Her lips trembled, her eyes wet, but no words came. Shock rippled through the family. Betrayers crumbled, gasps filled the room, tears flowed freely. And in the middle of it all, Emily clung to her father, sobbing into his chest as Richard whispered, "You are my legacy, Emily. You, not the empire, not the wealth. You." In the end, Richard Cole discovered a truth darker than any illness. That betrayal doesn't come from strangers, but from the very people you share your home with. Evelyn, Michael, Daniel, and Sophia, the ones he raised, the ones he trusted, each revealed their true colors when they thought he was dying. They chose greed, power, and self-interest over loyalty and love. But Emily, the quiet, overlooked child, stood firm. She wept for her father, not his fortune. She clung to the man, not the empire. And because of that, she alone inherited not just his wealth but his trust. Henry Davis, the lawyer who protected Richard's secrets, and Dr. Parker, the man who carried out the ruse, both knew this revelation would destroy the Cole family. And yet, Richard pressed forward, unmasking every lie, stripping away every false loyalty until only the truth remained. The Cole empire didn't crumble that night, but the family did. And so the question lingers, a question that reaches far beyond the walls of the Cole mansion. If you were in Richard's shoes, surrounded by betrayal, lies, and greed, would you ever trust Evelyn again? Could you forgive Michael, Daniel, or Sophia? Or would you cut them off, just as Richard did, and leave everything in the hands of the one who never betrayed you? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. And if you thought the Cole family's story was shocking, just wait, because in our next documentary we uncover a tale even darker, one where loyalty is tested, not by money, but by survival itself. Make sure you subscribe, because you will not want to miss what comes next.